Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking to our guest today, Sophia Karim, architect and artist, about so many things, and this is another very important. She is an artist, and she draws and uses some of the materials that have been thrown away on website construction sites. You see, sorry about the website, construction sites. And she also uses rice starch and materials, old garments and materials at home, you see.
Yeah.
How do you combine that with your knowledge about architecture? I mean, is it the artistic part in your mind that takes you to those spots?
Yeah, so for me, art and architecture are not separate practices. They're part of the same practice. When I was working in commercial offices, there wasn't much opportunity for me to express my political ideas or my thoughts or even express ideas of poetry or philosophy in the built projects that I was asked to do. So I used to do it on the side. Now that I do my own work, I combine the two completely. So yeah, the thing of using construction materials. So when I used to go around site, I'd pick up old construction materials, and instead of using, buying a canvas and making my drawings on those, I'd make my paintings on cement particle board or pieces of block work and things like that. And then drawing as well. I think lots of people think that architects mainly draw on a computer now, but for me, hand drawing is an incredibly important part of my practice.
Yeah, I've seen the architects spending hours on the drawing board, you see, and over a cup of tea or coffee.
Yeah,
standing there
all night,
yeah.
Doing all-nighters of drawing and drawing and drawing. And actually the way architects draw is quite interesting, because it's not quite the same as many other artists draw, because you're often drawing to deadline.
Yeah.
You're doing technical drawings, and sometimes it's a bit like driving a car. You're almost drawing the lines and they're appearing before you can even think or process, and you're drawing for hours. But I also love drawing by hand and by the computer. I love making things on the computer. And what I found is quite interesting is that drawing on the computer has changed the way that the nature of my hand drawings. So the way the way that traditionally an artist would draw, paint the world outside the physical world. They would try to depict that on the page. Because I began modeling virtual worlds on the computer, at one stage I was quite interested to try and draw those worlds by hand. And I found that the nature of my lines, the pencil lines or the pen lines, began to change. So I think in the way that an artist previously, as they began to depict the physical world, their expression evolved, my hand drawings began to change a lot from drawing those virtual worlds. So I often change between the two.
You were talking about using items from construction sites and old garments, and I understand that what you're wearing today is also your good work.
It is. So this dress is the paintings on this dress are exactly what I said. They're from my computer drawings, where I would build worlds on the computer and then I paint them by hand. And I used to practice them on old bed sheets. And so instead of throwing away the old bed sheets, I then wear my clothes. There's also writing, you probably can't see yet. There's writing on this. The writing are again from my political essays. So this one in particular is from that political essay that I wrote on Islamophobia. And there's also canvas on this. And this canvas is from, I think the shop's called Modern Art in Dhaka New Market. And there was a really lovely little boy that works in that shop. He brought me tea and he rolled out the canvases for me, and he cut this special piece of canvas for me and gave it free. I think he's only about 12, and I came back to London and I just really cared for this piece of fabric he'd given me, and that's what I used. But the reason I use rice starch as well is because rice and cotton obviously have political and historical connotations in our culture. So at the moment I've begun only using Bangladeshi rice starch as solidarity with our rice farmers who are being priced out. And that whole the thing of using shari and rice starch began because as diaspora children growing up in the UK, one really strong memory I used to have of going back to Dhaka was the way that I could bond with women in my family by lying in their lap, and they'd stroke my hair, and people don't do that here in the UK. And I'd go and I'd sort of bury my face in their shari and they'd stroke my hair, and it was that smell of the rice starch and cotton so strong and emotional for me that whenever I work with those materials, or old lungis remind me of my chachas sitting around on the floor in Gram eating, the smell of wood smoke, the objects take on a sort of particular presence for me. And that's why I like using those materials.
But back home also things are changing, you see, that in villages also, I mean, most people would like to work in cities, so there are the bright lights and the good money, particularly the garments factories, they attract women and men. So the old family life, this structure, is slowly and gradually being broken and giving way to the modern concept. You see, I mean, the telephone in your pocket, see, is causing a lot of damage to the old norms of social interactions. You see, young boys and girls, they spend a lot of time. It's not very expensive to have a mobile phone and to go online and chat others, you see. But now they may not be aware of what's happening in their house, but they're talking to somebody thousands of miles away, you see. They pine for that person, they think for that person, and while maybe the old mother, old father, or somebody very close to the family is seeking their attention and they're not giving. See, this has happened recently, and this is happening, and we all talk about it, but nothing is being done. You see. Of course, also you mentioned that maybe grandfather, maybe grandmother, or aunties and aunts and uncles, they would just stroke the head of children, and there was a kind of it worked as a therapy. See.
Yeah.
But today, if you do that, you're risking. At the risk of being called something, see, because if you touch somebody, they might think, oh, it is this or that, see, because there is so much of negative ideas.
In Bangladesh?
Not in Bangladesh, I'm talking about the world. See.
Right, okay.
Bangladesh is no exception, see, because every other day you hear of stories about girls being raped or attacked, or people disappearing. That is no exception. But I'm talking about globally. This is a common phenomenon. So that is, the technology has harmed us. You were talking about computers, and so this idea came to my mind, that computer is very good to see. But it's also, I mean, graphic arts, graphic designing, computer helps to see. But people would have spent the whole thing, as I was talking about, I knew an architect, he would have spent hours. He says, not tonight, my friends say, I'm working whole night and I've got to hand in this project by day after tomorrow or something, you see. There were deadlines, you see. Anyway, we change the topic. You are a visiting critic at University of Westminster, the School of Architecture.
Yeah.
What do you do there?
Okay, so when you study architecture, a key part of the education is something called a crit. It's quite an intimidating process. It's where you present your design to a panel of tutors or visiting critics, which is what I do. And it's a bit like MasterChef or something where you stand up and you present it and they respond. And sometimes they can be quite nice and sometimes they can be very brutal. They're the judges. So at Westminster University I participate in giving commentary to undergraduate architecture students.
Is it a part of the evaluation of?
It's a part of their evaluation, yeah, it's a really interesting process and I love doing that. I find it really fascinating seeing what the students do, because in some senses they're doing much more radical or interesting work than what they will go on to do when they're in industry. Because like we already explained, other forces come into play, so the freedoms.
Right now they have the freedom.
Exactly.
You can express their ideas.
Yeah, and that's wonderful to see.
Right, see. Are you happy with the new generation of architects that are coming up and with bright ideas?
I think this is a really interesting time in architecture. So when I was in New York, in the block next to of my hotel, there's a school called Parsons School of Design, and I attended a master's tutorial there. And there's something of a renaissance happening in architecture at the moment, pretty much prompted by climate emergency, where architects are now looking at completely new ways of building and new materials. So a lot of what we were saying is the traditional forms of architecture or indigenous forms of architecture are now being reinvestigated, because people have realized that there was something about the way they did what they did, where they understood how to respect the planet. So materials such as earth or thatch are coming back in. They were rejected by the ultra-capitalist era because you can't make much profit from those materials because you have to keep rethatching or things like that. But in the face of climate emergency, architects are saying too late now to keep going with those models. We have to look at something called degrowth architecture, where value isn't only GDP and economic growth, value is in something else. So looking much more at indigenous materials and things. And so some of the students I was talking to, they were saying really interesting things, such as in the face of climate emergency, perhaps architecture as we know it is almost obsolete. Maybe we should be looking at the buildings we've already got and repurposing them. Other students are looking at completely different materials, so they're working with biologists, they're looking at algae, bacteria, different kind of materials to create buildings. In the face of automation, as human populations go down, perhaps we'll not even need architecture. In a kind of, if I take this completely to the furthest extent, scientists say that in automation, maybe the whole human consciousness of this planet could fit in something about a 3 millimeter cubed volume. You wouldn't need buildings for that.
It's very interesting. I was interviewing somebody from Oxford, a Bangladeshi chap, also as a scholar who is working on hypersonic spacecrafts, you see. And we were talking about this space and time, you see. And he said that space can be just turned like this, time can be turned like this, so you can be back to future.
Yes.
Anyway, that's also very interesting to hear about that. Your project, Books for Jail, just tell us briefly about that.
Okay, so this started when I was campaigning for my uncle. Many artists, writers helped us, and they were really open and generous. And after he was released, I started thinking, what could we do to help other prisoners who are still there? And started thinking about creating a library. And what I thought would be quite nice is, first of all, initially, just to approach the various artists and writers who'd helped us. And I said, could you just pull an old book off your shelf, one that maybe changed your life or has special meaning for you?
Well, Sophia, we are nearly the end of the time, and we have to wrap it up.
Oh, okay.
What a shame we couldn't complete that.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. It was
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for being with us, and we hope that you've enjoyed the show as much as we have. It was nice meeting you again after, say, about 3 months or something. We are from the new studios of NTV Europe, South Watford. See you again next week, same time, same channel.